Do you believe that even in the wildest nature miracles can happen? What you're about to see will warm your heart and maybe change the way you see the world. Amid a freezing landscape where wildlife fights daily battles against time, cold, and loneliness, a true story of compassion and courage emerged from the ice to touch thousands of hearts. This is more than a story of one bear cub in trouble. It is a silent cry for help that crossed the snow, the wind, and the fear, until it found a human heart willing to listen. Imagine a place where temperatures plummet to 45 degrees Celsius, the sky remains gray for days, and the sounds of the forest are drowned out by a constant blizzard. In the midst of this desolate scenario, close to the remote village of Utqiagvik in Alaska, a polar bear cub was left to his own devices. Small, thin, and injured, he wandered among ice floes with eyes full of despair. A heartbreaking portrait of the vulnerability of wildlife in a world that doesn't always offer second chances. Emotional animal stories have the power to transform us. And when it comes to animal rescue in extreme situations, every detail matters. Every decision can be the difference between life and death. The journey of this little bear, lost in the middle of the white expanse, began silently, like so many other stories forgotten by the snow. But destiny was about to change the course of his life, and that of anyone who dared to get close. As the days passed and hunger increased, the little bear, who would later be called Mika, gathered what was left of his strength and followed his instinct. He approached an old wooden cabin, a solitary refuge nestled in the heart of the tundra. Inside, he lived Honkai, a lonely man marked by losses who searched in the icy immensity for a meaning to continue living. An unlikely encounter was about to happen, a moment capable of moving even the most hardened hearts. Our channel's mission is to tell real stories of animals in danger, especially when they involve vulnerable puppies, moments of extreme animal survival, and connections between humans and wild creatures that defy all logic. And this story, in particular, has all the elements that make it unique: resilience, compassion, overcoming, and an unexpected miracle in the middle of the storm. Every second, thousands of animals face brutal conditions to survive. But every now and then, destiny crosses the right paths. And when this happens, we are reminded that instinct is not exclusive to animals. The instinct to protect, to feel empathy, to save, is also human. If you are moved by animal rescues in extreme conditions, if you believe that even in the harshest cold the warmth of a true bond can be born, this story will captivate you from beginning to end. A narrative where danger is real, hope is fragile, and each choice carries profound consequences. You will understand why thousands of people are sharing this video. You will feel the tension, the doubt, the fear, but you will also witness a miracle. And it is exactly at this point that everything starts to change. When Honkai hears a strange sound coming from the blizzard and approaches the cabin door, he has no idea what he will find outside. In the frozen heart of Alaska, near the remote Inuit village of Utqiagvik, temperatures reached 42 degrees Celsius. It was January 2020, and the solitude of that white expanse hid a story that no one could imagine. The piercing winds whistled like ancient laments among the frozen trees, and the sky, completely covered by heavy clouds of snow, seemed to crush the silence of the place. The landscape was absolute white, broken only by slowly moving shadows, dry logs, blocks of ice, and that night a staggering silhouette that seemed lost in time and space. The snow accumulated over everything with an almost symbolic weight, as if each flake carried the weight of a fate about to be sealed. It was in this scenario of brutal isolation that the little polar bear cub, alone and visibly injured, dragged his sleeping paws through the frost. He looked like he only had a few weeks to live. The thin skin let the cold escape straight to the bones. His eyes, although still innocent, already carried the tiredness of someone who had been snatched too soon from the warmth of his mother's lap. The Utqiagvik region, known for its Inuit traditions and coexistence with Arctic fauna, had already witnessed incredible stories of wild animals fighting for life. But rarely did anyone see, with their own eyes, such a young creature in such vulnerability. The little bear wandered aimlessly, guided only by the survival instinct, That same instinct that, ironically, led him towards the presence of something that should be dangerous to him, a human being. On the other side of the weathered wooden wall, inside the cabin, was Honkai, a man of few words and many silences. A former soldier, isolated from the world by choice, he sought in the solitude of nature a way to find meaning again after losses that had torn him apart inside. On nights like these, he warmed himself with herbal tea, carefully stacked firewood, and memories that never seemed to grow cold. It was in the middle of this silent ritual that a fragile sound broke the monotony of the blizzard. A lament, almost a groan. Honkai frowned. He slowly got up, took his flashlight and opened the cabin door. Light swept through the darkness amidst the storm, revealing something that made him freeze, not from the cold, but from shock. Before him, with pleading eyes and trembling body, was the little bear, one puppy in trouble, left to die. The immediate instinct was to retreat. Every hunter in that region knew, bears are dangerous, even cubs. Where there is a little one, there may be a mother nearby. And even if he was alone, the protocol was clear, not to interfere. But there was something in that animal's gaze, something that cut through any barrier of rationality. It was the look of someone asking for help and hoping to be heard. Honkai hesitated. His fingers gripped the door handle tightly. He watched the cub, analyzing every movement, as if the decision of life or death was on his shoulders. And it was. Outside, the little bear could barely stand. He staggered, slipped on the ice, and looked back at the light as if it were his only hope. In a split second, a memory crossed Honkai's mind, that of his little daughter, who he had lost years before. That bear's eyes, as impossible as it seemed, were the same eyes he had last seen in the hospital. And in that moment, all logic disappeared. With slow steps, he walked towards the bear, cautiously extended his hand and watched as the little one, as in a gesture of instinctive trust, approached, huddled close to the door, and closed his eyes, as if to say, "Here, I'm safe." Honkai didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't leave him there. He brought the animal inside, carefully, as if carrying a fragile baby. He placed blankets around them, heated milk with what he had available, and offered a piece of dried fish that he kept as a reserve. The bear ate slowly, without the strength to react to anything else. That night was long. Honkai didn't sleep a wink. Every time the puppy trembled, she got up to check if he was still breathing. It wasn't just a rescue. It was the rebirth of something he thought was lost forever. A sense of care. This story is just beginning, and what comes next will move you even more. Because sometimes the greatest wildlife miracles happen not through luck, but through courageous choices made in the silence of a freezing night. If you have ever felt, even once, that the connection between humans and animals, it goes beyond instinct, continue here. And if you've reached this point, with your heart racing, tell me in the comments. I believe in the power of compassion. This helps the channel a lot, and I want to know if you also believe in this force that transforms. Honkai, he wasn't the kind of man who looked for company. After years of serving in conflict zones, he traded the deafening sounds of war for the absolute silence of glaciers. When he lost his wife, the only person who could break through the walls he had built around his own soul, he walked away from everything. He has taken refuge at the edge of the world, near Utqiagvik, where time seems frozen and the only thing that really moves is the bitter wind blowing over the tundra. In that forgotten corner of Alaska, he found an almost ritualistic routine, waking up with the pale sunrise, chopping wood, fishing, cooking in silence. The sound of the kettle boiling was often the only noise that broke the weight of his loneliness. He lived in an old wooden hut built by his Inuit grandfather, a man who taught him from an early age the codes of respect for nature and wild animals. There were no luxuries in that space, just the essentials: a bed, a wood stove, some hanging utensils, and shelves full of dry supplies and hunting equipment. Honkai was a man of simple habits and a heart hardened by pain. But he was also a man of honor, who recognized the spiritual strength of Arctic animals, especially bears, considered by his ancestral culture as guides between the worlds. He grew up hearing stories of bears that appeared in men's dreams, bringing messages from beyond, or warnings from the Earth Spirit. Despite his military background, where he learned to act coolly and calculate every risk, Honkai never left aside his sensitivity to listen to what the environment was saying. He read footprints like someone reading letters. I listened to the wind like someone listening to advice. The presence of an animal at his door was unusual, especially this one. The little polar bear, in a state of total exhaustion, lying at the entrance as if he knew that there perhaps he would find more than shelter. Perhaps he would find the chance to survive. That meeting broke Honkai's monotonous routine. For the first time in years, he felt something different. A restlessness. A calling. The puppy's eyes, big, round, reflecting fear and confidence at the same time, touched something deep inside him that he thought had been buried forever. As much as the codes of life on the ice screamed that interfering was wrong, that any involvement with wildlife could have serious consequences, something inside him, something that wasn't logical but visceral, said he couldn't turn his back. And that was how, for the first time since he isolated himself, Honkai broke a rule. He brought the cub into the cabin. He made a nest of blankets next to the wood stove. He took some smoked fish, softened in hot water, and fed it to the bear with his hands. And while the cub devoured each piece with difficulty, with ragged breathing, Honkai remained there, kneeling on the ground, watching. I tried to understand why that presence appeared right there, right on that night. It felt like destiny. It felt like some kind of redemption. It was impossible not to notice the marks of struggle on the bear's body. Scratches on his belly, a bruised hind leg, and the fur on his head was slightly singed, as if he had gotten too close to something hot. Perhaps fire. Honkai slowly ran his hand over the puppy's grayish-white fur, with the care of someone who has already carried a child in his arms. And for a moment, he allowed himself to remember. The memory of his wife, of when the two planned to have children who never came, and of the emptiness that was installed after her death. Maybe it was just a lack. Maybe it was something bigger. In Inuit culture, everything has a meaning. No animal crosses a man's path without purpose. That wasn't just a bear cub in trouble. It was a link between worlds, a silent request from the universe for Honkai to finally be part of something again. He didn't know how long the bear would resist, but she knew that while she was there, she would do everything in her power to make sure he lived. It was the first time in a long time that his dormant instinct to protect had awakened with such force. And so began the first days of coexistence between a man marked by silence and a puppy marked by pain. Honkai started to get up earlier to check if the little one was still breathing. Each day, I noticed small improvements, a more vivid look, one more staggering step. With each advance, a breath of hope. But the danger still lurked. Honkai knew that keeping a bear at home could invite trouble, not just with environmental authorities, but also with larger predators, like other bears, who might be attracted to the cub's scent or proximity to instinctual territory. He began to reinforce the cabin's locks, to watch the perimeter every morning, and to arm himself no longer for personal protection, but out of responsibility for that defenseless being. The routine has completely changed. It was like caring for a wild newborn. There were nights when the bear cried, making high-pitched sounds that cut through the darkness. In others, he simply slept next to the stove, as if the pain had overcome him. And it was on one of these silent dawns that Honkai found himself talking. Not with the bear, but with himself, in a low voice, as if the weight of the silence was finally beginning to dissipate. He told old stories, memories of his father, of life before the war, of the woman he loved so much, and the puppy just listened, as if he understood every word. The northern lights began to appear more frequently in the sky. The colors danced like divine signs. Honkai, in silence, watched with the bear lying beside him, and for the first time in years he felt something he almost didn't recognize because he had forgotten. Peace. The feeling that somehow he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And it was in this moment of apparent calm that something on the horizon began to change. Because the snow, no matter how silent it is, never hides what needs to be revealed. In a silent dawn, the kind where even the wind seems to respect the absolute silence of the snow, Honkai was awakened by an unusual sound. It was something faint, almost imperceptible, as if nature itself was trying to whisper an urgency. The sound was repeated at short intervals, a kind of hoarse groan muffled by the thickness of the blizzard. He got up from the fur bed with a start. In that wild territory, any unusual noise could mean danger. An experienced hunter, he knew how to distinguish the sounds of storms, wolves, howling winds, and the cracking of frozen wood. But this one was different. It was the kind of sound that didn't come from the forest. It came from pain. He quickly put on his thick caribou fur coat, slipped on his wool-lined boots, and grabbed his flashlight. Every step inside the cabin creaked as if time had also woken up. As he slowly turned the door handle, the click of metal was swallowed by the icy darkness that took over outside. When the door opened, the flashlight's light cut through the snow mist and focused on something that made him freeze inside. There, lying in a clump of crunched snow, trembling like a leaf, was a polar bear cub. One puppy in trouble, defenseless, hurt, with the most human look that Honkai had ever seen on a wild animal. The shock was immediate. The first reaction was alert. Instinct said to back off, close the door and wait. Because a puppy alone invites tragedy, it means mom might be nearby. And an angry mother bear protecting her cub is one of the most feared forces in nature. But there was something wrong, very wrong. The puppy didn't move. His eyes, half open, were blurry. Breathing was short. The once white fur was now stained with dried blood, and small shards of ice stuck to the open wounds on its side. It was as if time had stopped there to show Honkai a scene he would never forget. He stood still for long seconds, his fingers still firmly on the door. The flashlight light trembled in his hand. No sound other than the crunch of snow beneath the bear's fragile paws as he tried in vain to crawl closer to the heat source. It was as if he knew that there, behind that door, was the only chance to live. And even without knowing it, he begged for help. Not with words, not with gestures, just by looking. A look that broke every rational barrier within Honkai. Slowly he knelt in the doorway, keeping his eyes fixed on the small, outstretched body. His heart was pounding in his chest. Every breath he heard from the cub seemed to be his last. The instinct, the one he had carried since he was a boy, learned from his elders, forged in the military jungle and tempered by the pain of life, said, "Help." Still hesitant, he took the first step out of the cabin, sinking his boot into the snow. He approached carefully without sudden movements, respecting the wild nature of the moment, and then he knelt down next to the little being. He touched it with his gloved fingertips. It was freezing. So cold it was almost like touching death itself. But he was still alive. Honkai took the cub in his arms, feeling the weight too light for the size it should have been. This only confirmed his suspicion. He had gone days, perhaps weeks, without enough food. It had probably been separated from its mother during some crossing, perhaps in a desperate attempt by the bear to save her cub from an attack by predators, or perhaps she had fallen victim to the harsh realities of nature, hunters, or even the deadly climate itself that so often takes lives without any warning. He knew none of this for sure, but something was undeniable. The little one would not have survived another night out there. Back at the hut with the puppy cradled in his arms as if it were a newborn, Honkai acted with the precision of someone who has cared for the injured in extreme scenarios. He placed the bear next to the fireplace, prepared a light mixture of milk and fish fat, and offered it with a small wooden spoon, drop by drop, until the cub could swallow it. His paws were shaking. His eyes didn't blink, but he couldn't resist the heat. He instinctively settled himself close to the warm wood, as if his body knew that there, at that moment, the danger had receded. Honkai didn't sleep that night. He stayed there next to the animal, watching every movement, regulating the fire in the fireplace, changing the cloths with melted snow to clean the wounds. At one point, he placed one of his blankets over the puppy's body and sat on the floor, watching him breathe. The sound of the storm outside continued violently, but inside the cabin there was a pause, an interval of peace between two completely different worlds, that of a man marked by invisible scars and that of a wild cub that almost didn't survive. The morning passed slowly, as if time had been extended to give life a chance. When the first faint beam of light broke through the ice-covered windows, the cub gave a soft, deeper sigh. He still didn't have the strength to get up, but there was something new in his body. A will. Honkai saw this. He knew how to recognize when a being was struggling to live. And at that moment he understood that he was no longer alone in that fight. Have you come this far, feeling this connection? So tell me in the comments what you would have done in Honkai's place. Write the word instinct if you believe that sometimes the heart speaks louder than any rule. And of course, if this story is touching you, subscribe to the channel. We have many real stories like this, from puppies in trouble, extreme rescues, and unlikely bonds between humans and wild animals, and you will be even more moved in the next chapters. Honkai knew what he was doing. His every gesture, no matter how careful it seemed, carried the weight of a deadly dilemma. Feeding a wild bear, even if it was just a cub, meant breaking rules established by environmental authorities, laws that protected both animals and humans. Getting directly involved with a wild cub, sheltering it, caring for it, was seen as human interference in a natural process. Many believed that by intervening, man was disrupting the cycle of wildlife. But Honkai was no ordinary man. And that wasn't just any bear. It was a puppy in trouble, about to succumb to cold, hunger, and oblivion. He was not a statistic. It was a life. A real, fragile presence, suffering before the eyes of a man who had seen too much suffering. On that frozen morning, as the sun peeked timidly through the heavy clouds that covered the Arctic, Honkai sat in front of the fireplace. The cub slept, still breathing weakly, but more stable than the night before. The wounds were clean. The still, thin body moved little by little, searching for the heat that was escaping from the embers. And it was there, observing that creature, that Honkai realized the depth of the choice he had made, and the one he still had to make. He could no longer simply wait. He needed to decide whether he would continue taking care of the puppy, risking being reported, punished, perhaps even arrested, or whether he would leave the little one to his fate and try to convince himself that he had done enough. But how do you let go of someone who once looked at you with trust? How do you turn your back on a being that has found refuge in our hands? This wasn't just about save an animal in danger. It was about listening to your own conscience, about recognizing that sometimes the laws of nature need to coexist with the laws of the heart. And Honkai's heart, although calloused by old pain, beat more strongly with each hour he spent next to that puppy. He knew that environmental agents could appear at any time. He knew that if they discovered what he was doing, he could be accused of domesticating a wild species, of unduly interfering with the habitat. But deep down, Honkai also knew that if he didn't do anything, no one would. The area was too remote. There were no rescue teams nearby. There was no hotline to wildlife sanctuaries. Everything was in his hands. It was a responsibility he had not asked for, but one that life had placed before him, as a test perhaps, or a second calling to fulfill a greater purpose. The hours passed, and the puppy began to show small signs of improvement. He drank more water, accepted small pieces of fish, and risked lifting his head to look around. The eyes were still cloudy, but now there was light in them. Hope. Honkai started calling him Mika, which in Inuit means small, a simple name but full of meaning. Because even when he was small, Mika had provoked a revolution in that man's soul. And the more Mika grew stronger, the more the dilemma grew within Honkai. He knew that soon the cub would need to get out of there. I couldn't live in a cabin. He couldn't get used to the human smell, to the domestic routine. I needed to return to nature. But how to do this with an animal that is still so fragile, that had created such deep bonds? And more, how to deal with the possible arrival of the authorities, who could interpret everything in the worst way. Honkai began writing down his days in an old notebook. He recorded Mika's every advance, every different reaction, every gesture that showed that he was still, above all, a wild animal. It helped him remember what he needed to do, prepare Mika day after day, to return to the world from which he came. But how do you teach a bear cub, so young, to survive on its own? How do you let go of a life you helped save? There were days when Honkai thought about building an outdoor enclosure, where Mika could get used to the snow again, to the smell of the trees, to the strong wind. In others, the idea of releasing him alone in the middle of the forest was unbearable. And there was also fear. The fear that the bond between the two had become too strong, that the puppy didn't want to leave anymore, or worse, that fate would decide for them and take Mika before any plan could be put into practice. The nights were silent again, but now there was a new sound. Mika's calm breathing next to the stove, her little sighs, her paws that sometimes moved in her sleep. Honkai, even in silence, felt that he was no longer alone. For the first time in a long time, there was another presence in his life, one who didn't speak, didn't judge, but who thanked him with her eyes and the way she snuggled against his chest on the coldest nights. The decision still needed to be made, but it wouldn't be now. For now he would continue to care, one day at a time, one gesture at a time. A fish broken into small pieces, a word murmured in the dark, a look shared without haste. He knew this bond had an expiration date, that Mika belonged to the snow, to the mountains, to the wild trails where men dare not enter. But until then, he would be the family that Puppy didn't have. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you, would you have the courage to do what Honkai did? Comment the word below decision, if you believe that sometimes the hardest choices are also the right ones. And if this story is touching you like it touched me when I wrote it, subscribe to the channel right now. Here, each video is a tribute to wildlife, heartwarming rescues, and the inexplicable connection between humans and animals. Honkai. He was never a man of impulses. His entire life had been guided by discipline, strategy, self-control. In the army, he learned to suppress emotions to make decisions under pressure. In the forest, he learned to listen to the silence before taking any action. But nothing prepared him for what he felt when he saw that polar bear cub on the verge of death, stretched out in front of the cabin door, with his eyes asking for help without making a sound. And even with his mind screaming that this was a mistake, that he was crossing limits that could cost him dearly, it was his heart that spoke loudest. At that moment, without needing words, he made the choice that would change everything. He broke all the rules. He knew better than to feed a wild animal. He knew that bonding with a bear was dangerous, both for himself and for the animal itself, which could lose its ability to live in the wild. But how could he ignore the pain that moved before his eyes? How can you look at that thin, trembling body and turn away, saying, "I can't get involved"? So he did what instinct told him, those instincts that surpass any training, instinct to protect, to welcome, to save. That night, after carefully bandaging the injured paws of little Mika, as he began to call the puppy, Honkai dragged his blanket close to the door. It was snowing heavily, and he knew the bear's scent could attract predators. Bigger, hungry bears, wolves, animals that roamed in the darkness looking for signs of weakness. And Mika was exactly that, a sign of weakness, an easy target. Therefore, Honkai slept there, sitting with the rifle between his knees, his eyes half closed, listening for any sound that did not belong inside the cabin. Life in that territory has always been a matter of vigilance, but now he wasn't just watching for himself. He watched for two. And in that freezing dawn, for the first time in years, Honkai dreamed. He dreamed of the daughter he never knew, of the empty lap he had carried since his wife passed away, of a sweet voice calling to him on the wind. And in the middle of it all, there was Mika, running through the snow, free, strong. It was as if fate was showing him that that little being was not just an animal, but a symbol, a mirror of one's own wounded soul, which now found space to heal. In the following days, the routine changed. Honkai started sharing his meals with the cub. He prepared small portions of dried, boiled, and shredded fish, feeding Mika several times a day. When the snow stopped, he took the puppy outside, wrapped in blankets, and let him feel the fresh air, the smell of the forest, the sound of the snow under his paws. Little by little, Mika began to react. First, he lifted his head more firmly, so I tried to stand up, still shaking. Until, one clear morning, he took his first steps, Short, clumsy, but determined. Every move was a victory. And each victory was celebrated in silence by Honkai, who watched from afar with teary eyes. He didn't say anything. It didn't need to. His look said it all. Every day, the bond between the two grew stronger. Mika was not domesticated. Far from it. He still carried in his eyes the wild strength that defines the great animals of the Arctic. But there was something between them, an invisible agreement, a pact of trust. And even with all this connection, Honkai knew that it couldn't last forever. It was a matter of time before someone found out. The village of Utqiagvik, although distant, had scouts who occasionally patrolled the region, and any sign of an animal being kept outside its natural habitat could trigger complaints. Plus, there was Mika himself, who, if he grew too big and got used to human presence, could lose his chances of returning to his territory like a true wild bear. The time window was short. Honkai needed to balance care and detachment, even if his heart had already chosen. The dilemma was in every gesture. Every time Mika leaned against him to sleep, he felt his chest tighten. With every sound the bear made when he woke up, as if he were calling to him, the paternal instinct returned with force. It was impossible not to get involved, not after seeing that broken being and helping him get up. So Honkai started doing something different. He started training Mika to teach, as far as possible, the first signs of independence. He hid pieces of food around the cabin so the bear could develop his sense of smell. It created small barriers for him to climb. It simulated natural obstacles with branches, snow, ice. I knew I could never replace what a mother bear would teach her cub, but if he could at least give Mika a chance to face the world with more strength, he would have done something great. And time, as always, continued relentlessly. The seasons passed. Mika's fur grew thicker. The paws steadied. The eyes gained shine. The little cub in trouble was no longer so little. And Honkai, even though he was afraid of what that meant, didn't back down. He continued to be the silent guardian of an animal that he knew, deep down, he would have to let go. If you're feeling what I'm feeling as I tell this story, tell me in the comments. Write Wild Heart if you also believe that there are bonds that reason cannot explain. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel now. Real stories like this about heartwarming wild animal rescues, vulnerable cubs, and life-changing decisions are still to come, and you won't want to miss what happens next. As the days went by, what was once just a desperate attempt to survive began to take on the shape of something much deeper. The little polar bear, now called Mika, an Inuit name that carries the meaning of small, he was no longer just a cub in trouble. He was beginning to blossom. Slowly, day by day, his energy returned. The wounds healed, the fur thickened, and the eyes, once clouded with pain, now shone with something new, confidence. And that's when what no one would ever expect in the middle of the icy tundra happened. An unexpected connection between human and wild animal. A connection that escaped logic and transcended any instinct of self-preservation. Mika, who at first could barely stand, now approached Honkai of her own accord, not just in search of food or warmth, but for something more subtle, the feeling of belonging. There were times when the bear would lie down on the wooden floor of the cabin and, with a soft sigh, rest its head on Honkai's lap like a cub would do with its mother. It was as if, in the absence of his real family, he had chosen that silent man as his security reference. And Honkai, even though he tried to maintain the emotional distance that reason demanded of him, was unable to resist that pure gesture of surrender. With every touch, with every look, something inside him reorganized. During the mornings, Honkai would take Mika outside, wrapped in caribou skins to protect him from the wind. Little by little, I let him touch the snow with his own paws, feel the cold texture between his fingers, reconnect with the world to which he belonged. The puppy walked slowly, looked around curiously, but always returned to the man he now considered his reference figure. It was like seeing a wild bear rediscovering its natural instinct, but still tied to an invisible bond of gratitude and affection. And there, among the ice floes and the gray sky, touching scenes became part of everyday life. One afternoon, Honkai noticed that Mika followed him wherever he went, even when he just went out to chop wood. The puppy walked behind him with slow steps, sometimes stumbling, but always persistent. And when Honkai stopped, he stopped too. He sat on the side like a faithful watchdog, as if saying silently, "I am with you." It was impossible not to be moved by that. The connection between humans and animals, which is so often portrayed in stories and legends, was happening there, before the eyes of those who never believed that they could still hold on to something. Honkai, who had been avoiding any human involvement for months, was now smiling, even if discreetly, when he saw Mika sleeping curled up at his feet. The man who had withdrawn from the world because he could no longer bear losses began to allow something new to grow within him. Hope. On quieter nights, with the fireplace crackling softly, Honkai would talk. He was talking to Mika, yes, but he was also talking to himself. He told old stories, childhood memories, memories of his wife. Mika listened with attentive eyes, as if he understood every word, every pause, every emotion. The cabin, once silent as a tomb, now breathed life. That subtle exchange between man and animal healed invisible wounds, rebuilt bonds broken by pain and filled voids that no medicine had been able to reach. There was one moment in particular that Honkai would never forget. It was late afternoon. Orange light streamed through the frost-covered window, casting warm reflections on the cabin floor. Mika, lying next to the stove, slowly got up, approached Honkai and, with a slight push, placed his front paws on his lap, as if looking for a hug. It was a simple gesture, but full of symbolism. A request for affection, an acknowledgement of affection. Honkai, without saying a word, just passed his hand gently over the puppy's neck. And in that gesture, two worlds met, two beings marked by loss, who were now healing each other. But this approach also brought with it a new type of tension. Honkai knew that the more Mika got used to human presence, the harder it would be for him to reintegrate into the wild. And yet, how can we deny the gift? How can you turn down the chance to experience a miracle in the middle of the ice? It was a cruel paradox. The stronger they became together, the more painful the inevitable separation would be. But at that moment, Honkai decided not to think about the end. He preferred to live in the now, live the small gestures, the shining eyes, the shared warmth, the steps side by side in the freshly fallen snow. If you're feeling the strength of this story like I am now, leave a comment in the comments. Connection. And tell me, do you believe that animals also choose who to trust? I read everything. And if you are not yet part of our community, subscribe to the channel right now. Here you will find real exciting stories about wild animal rescues, puppies in danger, and unexpected bonds that remind us what it is to be human. And prepare your heart, because what comes next is even more intense. The day of farewell arrived without warning. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The wind was blowing more gently, and the ice, although still thick, was already beginning to show signs that the extreme weather was letting up. It was the ideal time for the arrival of the team of biologists that Honkai had discreetly alerted, weeks before, through an emergency radio that he only used in very specific situations. He knew he couldn't keep Mika forever. Did you know that a wild bear in rehabilitation needs, at some point, to return to its habitat, to its world? Even so, when he saw the helicopter approaching, cutting out the white sky with its black propellers, he felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Mika, in turn, reacted strangely. The new sound, the different smell, the uniformed humans. All of that made him alert, but he didn't run away. He stayed by Honkai's side as he always did when he was afraid. She leaned against his leg, without understanding that that moment was the beginning of the end of that intense and transformative coexistence. Biologists were careful. They had been informed of the situation. They knew that the animal had been rescued by a resident of the region. And unlike many stories in which bears end up too accustomed to humans, Mika still maintained her wild instincts. an achievement that Honkai was keen to preserve. They sedated the puppy with a light dose, just enough to transport him safely. And even under the influence of the tranquilizer, Mika resisted. He looked back at the cabin, at the man who took him in, with eyes that seemed to ask, "Why are you leaving me?" Honkai remained there, motionless, watching the helicopter take off and disappear over the horizon. The snow began to fall again, thin, almost respectful, as if the sky itself wanted to honor that moment. Mika left, and Honkai stayed. Once again, silence took over the cabin, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't the same dark void as before. It was an absence filled with memories. For the sounds that had already existed there, the clumsy footsteps on the floor, the heavy sighs in sleep, the sound of the bowl being dragged with the nose, and above all the sound of the bond that still existed, even from a distance. The months that followed were slow. The routine returned, like an old heavy cloak. Honkai chopped firewood, fished, took care of the hut, but something inside him had changed permanently. He spent more time outdoors, looking at footprints in the snow, trying to decipher if any animals had passed that way. I walked along the nearby trails, sometimes hoping to see a sign, a sound, a trail that would indicate that Mika was okay, that she had survived the rehabilitation process. And although there was no official news from biologists, something inside him said that Mika was alive, strong, learning, growing up. Winter has arrived again. The winds returned with more force, and the snow covered everything like a huge sheet. Honkai kept the fireplace burning longer. I prepared simple meals, and at night he still talked. Sometimes with silence, sometimes with emptiness next to the fireplace where Mika used to sleep. It was as if that space had never really been vacated. It was occupied by memory, for the presence that had left marks not only on the wood of the floor, but also in the heart of a man who, without realizing it, had felt again. And then, almost a year after that silent goodbye, something happened. It was an ordinary morning. The snow fell slowly, thickly. The air was heavy and white. Honkai was preparing coffee when he heard a low sound coming from outside. A sound that did not belong to the wind, nor to the ice. A sound that carried life. He dropped the mug on the table and ran to the door. When he opened it, his heart stopped for a moment. There, in the distance, amid the freezing fog, a silhouette was forming. A white, robust figure, walking with sure but not hurried steps. At first, Honkai thought it was just another bear in the region, which would already be rare. But there was something about the way he approached, the exact direction, the way he stared at the cabin, that made everything inside him scream. Era Mika. Now an adult, strong with the size of a true polar bear, he still had the same expression in his eyes. I recognized the path. I recognized the smell. I recognized the person. And when he got close enough for his eyes to meet Honkai's, there was no doubt. The bear sat down as he did when he was a cub. He didn't growl, he didn't threaten. He just stood there watching the man who once took him from death. Honkai approached with slow steps. He didn't dare touch or call. It just stopped a few meters away. They stayed like that for minutes that felt like hours. The man and the bear, the savior and the saved. The reunion between two beings who had changed each other's destiny. And when Mika got up again, turned around and walked back into the snow, it didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like a silent affirmation. I'm fine. I came back to show you that. Honkai stood there, still, with the wind cutting into his face. I didn't need anything else. What they experienced was there, present in the trail that the bear left in the snow. There were no words, just a silence loaded with meaning. He knew this moment was rare, a gift that few human beings have the chance to receive. Confirmation that he had done the right thing, what he had been reminded of. If this story moved you like it did me, I really want to read what you're feeling. Comment the sentence below, "He came back." If this reunion touched your heart, like it touched Honkai's. And if you haven't signed up yet, now is the time. Here, every story is real. Every moment is lived by animals and humans who find themselves in extreme scenarios. and create connections that neither time nor ice can erase. Then sign up now, activate the bell, and come with us for more exciting stories of puppies in trouble, unforgettable rescues, and bonds that defy all explanations. Because what comes next is even more unbelievable. Sometimes the most intense cold doesn't come from the snow outside, but from the silence that accumulates inside us over the years. From the emptiness that sets in when you lose someone, when you give up feeling, when pain freezes your heart to the point of making even the most beautiful of days pale, colorless, meaningless. Honkai knew well what this cold was. He had been carrying it for years. A cold that could not be dispelled by the fireplace, nor by the Arctic summer sun, nor by the fur cloaks that covered his body. It was the kind of cold that settles in the soul. And that's why the meeting with Mika wasn't just an animal rescue. It was the beginning of a deep emotional rescue, on two sides. Mika survived. He overcame abandonment, the cold, physical pain, and the constant risk of death. He regained the strength in his paws, the sparkle in his eyes, the firmness in his step. He learned to eat again, to explore, to observe. And then he returned to the wild where he belonged, like a true wild bear. But what no one saw, and perhaps few understand, is that this rescue was mutual. Because there, in the middle of the snow, it wasn't just a pup in trouble who found a second chance. He was a broken man who found his purpose again. Mika. He didn't save Honkai with heroic gestures, but with his silent presence. With the way he approached without fear. With eyes that said, "I trust you," without needing words. With the weight of your tired body resting on your lap. With the clumsy way he followed his footsteps through the snow, a constant reminder that he was no longer alone. And Honkai, who had lost himself within himself, began to thaw inside. With each meal he prepared, each wound he cleaned, each night he spent awake, he remembered what caring meant, what it was like to be responsible for another life. And with that, she found a new meaning for herself. It's curious how nature has this power to return us to ourselves. As an animal in extreme situation, like a wounded bear cub, can open more inner doors than years of solitude and silence. Sometimes, it is precisely when we offer help to those who need it most that we end up receiving the greatest gift. Not a material gift, not something you see with your eyes, but something you feel with your soul. Companionship, reciprocity, redemption. Honkai and Mika's story is not just about survival. It's about reunion, about how life gives us what we need, even when we stop asking for it. About how even a man who believed he had closed all the doors could still be surprised by a soft knock, or a faint groan from outside the door. And it's also about how compassion, even in the midst of strict rules, protocols, and real fears, can win. It can heat up. It can transform. After that unexpected reunion, Mika returned to the snow, to the infinite white where bears hunt, walk, live. But Honkai was never the same. He started leaving the cabin more often, preparing 2 portions of food, even though I knew no one else would come. Leaving visible tracks in the snow as if saying, "If you come back, I'll be here." And even if they never saw each other again, which he knew was likely, that brief moment when Mika's eyes recognized him, validated him, thanked him, had already changed everything. And this is what many of us forget in today's world, that there are rescues that happen without sirens, without headlines, without audiences. They happen in silence, between 2 lives that find themselves at the exact moment they need each other most. And that's what happened between Honkai and Mika. As I write this, I can imagine the shabby wooden floor of the cabin, the fireplace still burning, the cup of tea slowly cooling on the table. Outside, the wind blows as it always has, but now inside that cabin there is a different heat, a heat that doesn't come from fire, comes from memory, from the bond of the certainty that, in a cold world, 2 hearts warmed each other. And that, for Honkai, was everything. Stories like this show how love can blossom even in the harshest ice. If your heart was warmed by this journey between Honkai and Mika, leave your like, This helps this message reach more people who believe in the power of compassion. If you've made it this far, I want to invite you to comment on the phrase, "Love also warms the snow." I'll love knowing that you felt this deep connection until the end. It is clear. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Here you will find many other real stories of puppies in trouble, exciting rescues and reunions that prove that the impossible can happen. Oh, and doesn't come out yet. Oh, the next video is already appearing on your screen. Click on it and continue with us on this journey of emotions, because the next chapter will touch you even deeper.